Hi, I'm Jan Gray, and I hope you're having a terrific week. I'm looking forward to sharing this watercolor stamping spring bench illustration that I created for my February bullet journal. Now, bullet journals are great because they're great for helping us keep track of organization. I'm using it to help me keep track of my notes in a study that I'm doing to read through the New Testament in a year. But the fun thing about them is that you have some room for creativity, like on your cover page or your title page, and that's where I'm using this little illustration for my February cover page. Now, if you are not a bullet journaler, stay tuned. I'll show you how I use this on a card. To begin with, let me show you the stamps that I'm using from Art Impressions. Now, I will have all the ones I used linked down below, but they're really interchangeable once you kind of know how you use each of these stamps to create these little watercolor paintings. But I wanted you to see which ones I'm using. But go through the ones that you have, and if you want to substitute a particular foliage for one that you have, do. That's the beauty of how these stamps interact with each other. I'm going to use this little leaf set for our tree, and this branch will be used to kind of create our overhang. So let me walk you through the markers that I'm going to be using. Now, I love using the Marguerite Plume markers. They come in this dual tipped format. One is a fine tip and one is that nice lovely brush. Come in a real variety of colors. There are two of them that are kind of the staple. The sepia, which has that kind of greenish woodsy color to it, and then African violet, which helps us create kind of those cool shadows and light colored buildings and containers. The rest of these are just a matter of preference for what you use, but I've listed them there on the screen if you want to stop and pause it and get a screenshot. I'm using a number 4 round brush, a little bit of water. I've got some label tape that I'm going to use to create a little mask. Definitely going to need some little stamp platforms, a palette, and my stamp positioner. A few little projects. Now, if you missed my introduction to watercolor stamping, I'm going to link that up in the corner here because that shows you how you use each of these stamps to create the effect that you want. So let's get started with just the very basic image. We always start with the basic image, and I'm going to use this little bench, and I'm going to stamp it twice. I'm going to stamp it once on my watercolor paper, and then I'm also going to stamp it on my masking tape to kind of cut out and mask the edges. Now, what I'm showing you there is that I'm going to want to leave a little spot for that container over there. So as I'm inking it up, I'm just going to not put any ink there. So I'm going to start with the sepia, and I'm going to ink all of these lines. Notice I'm using the side of my marker to go over all of these lines, and I'm kind of keeping in mind where that container is going to go. But I'm going to add that in. Now the sepia, what I love about the sepia is that when you add water to it, you kind of get these undertones of greens and browns. It's kind of the color of outdoors. So even if we're going to add some other color to this bench, and we will, to make it kind of look like it's been weathered and painted maybe multiple times, you still want to start with that basic sepia as your base ink. And I'm going to stamp it a little bit, maybe pretty close to the center, but maybe down just a little bit. And I'm going to stamp the bottom of it again and cut that out so that I have a mask. And through the magic of television, I already have one made, and I'm going to put that onto my bench, covering up the parts that I want to protect because we're going to stamp that cobblestone ground cover, and we want it to look like the bench is in front of that cobblestone. So by stamping it first and masking it, then everything that we stamp next is going to appear to be behind the bench, or underneath the bench, if you will. So I'm going to start with my sepia again, because it's the color of all outdoors. And then just to kind of add a little bit of interest to it, I'm going to take a little bit of olive green, and you'll notice I'm not putting it everywhere. And you'll notice I didn't ink up the whole stamp. I kind of want the cobblestones to disappear into the foreground. I want to take them up beyond the bottom edge of the bench. And I'm just going to press that down. And normally on projects you kind of ink, you stamp, and you begin to do the color all at once. But for these 3 images, they're all kind of the main focal image, and I'm going to get them all in place before we start pulling color out of the lines. So now I'm going to do my container. And to put the container exactly where I want it, I'm going to use my stamp positioner. Now don't be scared of a stamp positioner. It's a great little tool because it allows you to place your image exactly where you want it. I want this container to be kind of a lighter color, so I'm using African Violet on it, and I'm going to put it up in the corner, and you use that corner to make sure that every time you're stamping that stamping block in the exact same place. So you push it against there. So now I have an image on that shield, and I can go place it and figure out where I want it on my illustration. Once I have that in place, I put the little L bar there, because now I can use it to put this stamp exactly in the same place that it was before. I ink it up again with my African Violet, put it in place, and stamp it down. Now I'm not pressing really hard. If you press really hard, you'll kind of get muddy lines. I just was holding it in place while I move the bar out of the way. So now we're going to begin by pulling out the color in these lines. This is where we get our color from. And remember, we want to deal with each of these slats as little individual pieces. So we don't want to go across the lines. We don't want to paint side to side on those lines that are up and down, and we don't want to paint up and down on those lines that are side to side. If we do that, it takes away the shape of the illustration, and we begin to just kind of have a mess. But you'll see I'm just pulling out the color wherever the color would be darkest, which is right up underneath the edge of that top bar, and down the sides in between there. Now we're going to come back and add some color, but this is just loosening up the ink and beginning to fill in that color. Definitely going to be darkest there underneath the legs where they're in shadow of the bench that's on top of them. So kind of bring that down. And I want to fill in just a little bit of color behind there. And now let's work on the pot. So I'm going to pull the color out of this line, and remember, if we want something to look round, and obviously this container is rounded, we want it to stay darkest on the sides and leave a little highlight in the center. And we're going to go back and add a little color to this later as well, but I'm going to pull a little bit of that shadow out to show that it is sitting on that bench. The sun is coming, I'm imagining the light kind of coming from the upper left there. And now let's go in and let's make these cobblestones look rounded. And the thing about watercolor stamping, if you want it to look somewhat realistic, don't go in and fill in everything solid. You want there to be highlights. So I'm kind of making these little curved marks. You'll notice that I'm following the shapes, but I'm kind of making an L, if you will, so that there's a little bit of color on one side and across the bottom. I'm leaving the top edge of each of those without any paint on them whatsoever. And you'll see when we're done that it actually looks pretty good. It doesn't look like, well, why didn't she paint the whole brick? There is, with the suggestion of color is giving us the shape. You'll notice I'm making those front edges kind of rounded to kind of show that there is a roundness to these cobblestones. And we're going to do something a little bit later to make them pop even a little bit more. But that'll be enough for now. Now I'm going to stamp in our flowers into the pot. And I want to put in a little bit, I'm putting a little piece of tape in there to kind of mask it off. I'm going to use some foliage, and really any foliage that you have will do. You just want a few little leaves. Remember, we're going to stamp this multiple times. So I'm going to do it 3 or 4. If you can get 5 out of it, that's great. I'm going to put some on one side and some on the other. And this will just kind of frame our flowers in there really nicely. Remember to pinch off your brush. You don't want your brush too wet. And we're just going to go in and touch these leaves to activate the ink that is on them. We don't want to make them so mushy that you can't tell what they are. So we're not really painting. We're just touching each of those leaves with a little bit of water. Now we're going to nestle our flowers down inside there. So I'm brushing green onto the stems, and then taking aubergine and making the floral tops on those. Our container's protected, so I don't really have to worry too much about getting them stamp it twice, and then rock it so that I'm using just the flowers up on the top to fill it in. Nice little arrangement of flowers there. I'm going to touch each of those to activate. And it's that activating with the water that makes it look like a watercolor painting and not like a stamp. So just take your time. You'll kind of discover your own style. Do you want it to be really soft and abstract, or do you want it to have a little bit of the definition of the stamp? Just play with it and see which you like. I'm going to add a few of these long stems. I chose this one, but really any of the long stem stamps would look great. So I'm doing the stem of the long stem, and then I'm putting Prussian blue on, and I'm going to stamp this 3 times. I'm putting my mask back in place so I don't have to worry about the length of the stem. You'll notice those just kind of recede into the background and give a little height to our floral arrangement there. You'll notice I'm just touching to activate it. I'm letting the shape that's there kind of define what it's going to be, and I do not add any water to the stem. Now I want to add a little bit of color to this bench. I want to make it look kind of weathered, so I'm using this tropical, and I'm putting a little sepia because that's the original color that's in there. And I'm getting water on my brush and pinching it off. You don't want to put just a ton of color on or to begin with. So I'm going to start back here, and I've got this kind of grayed out with the sepia because in the shadow it's going to be the darkest. So you're going to see more of the sepia than you will of the green. But these that are up here at front, I can bring a little bit more of the green into it. And I like how just putting a little suggestion of color. You'll notice I am not filling in the whole slat of the board. I'm putting a little bit of color, bringing it down, and then letting the viewer's eye kind of fill it in for themselves. That looks so much more realistic than having a full painted piece of wood there. Doing that would make it look flat. Having some highlights and shadows, having contrast is what gives it its shape and form. And so I just try to keep, I put enough color there so that the viewer knows what's going on, but not so much that it looks like I have tediously painted each of those areas. You'll notice that I'm working in sections. I work in like shaped sections. I don't cover over the lines. Here in the front, I'm putting a little bit more color there right underneath that line because that indicates that there's a little bit of shadow there. Now you'll notice that my lines are getting a little blurry. That's the beauty of having that double-tipped marker. We can go back in here in a little bit and add some of that detail back in. I'm realizing I need a little shadow, so I put a little of the African violet out on my palette and adding that to the shadows on these legs, because shadows are typically cool. They're always going to be the color of the object with a little bit of cool shadow on top of it. And that's one of the ways that we can make something look really realistic, is make sure that there's color of the object. That bench had green on it, and I wanted to make sure there was plenty of green there to add some of the shadow on top of, so that what you get is the shadow turning that color a little cool. So here's where I realized I'm just going to go back in and put some of those lines back in, give a little bit of definition to anywhere that my water has softened. And I wanted to deepen those shadows on the shadow side of those legs. And a little bit of definition back up to those boards up in there. Anywhere that by adding this extra color has kind of softened some of the detail, you can go back in with that fine tip marker and add that back in. I'm going to add a couple little nail marks on the front of the bench. I think those details make it look much more realistic, and you can add those after it gets a little dark. Now let's work on these cobblestones, and I'm going to show you the thing that will just make it pop, and that is to take a little bit more color. I want to deepen the color on some of these because it's in shadow, and I'm going to tell you right now, I forgot to do the shadow underneath the bench until after I'd put it in the book. I come back and I show you doing that shadow. I got so carried away and excited about putting it in my bullet journal that I forgot to do that entirely. So I will come back, but you'll notice I'm adding that rounded little bit of color to the front and one side of these cobblestones, and that's what makes them look round and dimensional. And that's what we want, is we don't need to paint every little bit of the color, but we do need to make them look dimensional. I'm going to add a little bit of my grass. Remember, we put these in a line. We don't do bunches of them. But I'm going to kind of put a little bit of grass by each of the legs just to kind of ground it. And then I'm inking up just a little piece, not even the whole grass, and I'm making it so that it looks like some grass is growing up in between some of those cobblestones. Again, those little details are the things that I think make a painting look realistic. So I'm just adding a couple of those here and there, pulling out the color just a little bit, just to activate that. Make it not look like a stamped image. We want to soften it just a little bit. But for me, I like some of the stamped image to be there so it's pretty clear what it is. So I'm going to come in here close, because this is, for me, this is what the detail that really makes this little painting pop, is to go in and put the darkness of the grout in there. And you'll notice I'm doing a little curve there to show that it's a curved cobblestone that is there. And everywhere that it joins, I'm going in and just making a little mark, particularly these right here in the focal area of the image. I'm going to be a little less precise on those that are out further away, but right there in the focal image, I want to make sure that I've got nice grooves for each of those cobblestones, and that is what makes it look like we really have a little dimensional cobblestone walkway or path area, patio underneath this bench. Doesn't that little detail just make all the difference in the world? I think it does. So let's add our little tree in here just to frame a portion of it. You wouldn't have to do this. I think it would be a beautiful little painting without it, but I just kind of imagined sitting on this bench. It's February, and I realize I've made this a little spring painting. I think maybe having been out in Arizona last week and being around a little bit warmer weather, I kind of imagined in my head wanting to go and sit on a bench. And so I've created my February scene a little more springy than winter. Now I am using these little heart leaves, and these are brilliant because you get a bunch of leaves all at once. And remember, when we have a little grouping like this, we want to stamp 4 or 5 times around in a circle because you get that variation of light to dark that you really would see if you were looking at a tree. So the hard work has already been done. Bonnie has, the creator of Art Impression Stamps, has done all the hard work for us. If we just remember that when we have these little groupings of flowers or leaves, if we stamp them in a circle multiple times, we're going to get the effect that we want. And I'm just going to take my time and fill in around these branches. You can see that now it doesn't really matter that it was the same branch over and over again because we're covering up pieces of it. I want a little bit of the branch to show through, so I'm not totally covering it with leaves. Now I'm going to go back in, and as always, I have pinched the water off of my brush, and I'm just touching those leaves. And as I activate the ink, there's now ink on my brush, and so I can go outside of that area and touch some of that green outside of where those leaves are, and it just begins to make it look so much more like a little painting than something that we have just stamped. You'll pick up a little bit of the brown, you'll get a little of the green, and so you've got those really nice variation of colors. So I want to add a little sky in here. And here's something that is really critical. We don't have to paint all of the sky. I'm going in with some clean water and kind of defining the area that I want to put the sky. And now I'm going back in and touching a little bit of that blue. Not going all the way down to the bench. I'm going to go down a little bit down the side. Not going all the way off the page. We have a tendency to try and paint the whole sky. What I think works really well is to paint a suggestion of the sky, or a suggestion, and you'll see that it looks a lot better if there's just a little bit of it there. Now I wanted to add a little bit of color to our container. I'm using Prussian blue, and because it's round, I want to make sure that the darkest parts of this container are on the sides and leave that little highlight in the center. And you can see by using the African violet to start, this container looks like it might be an enamel container with a little bit of that vintage blue tone to it. Don't have to have it all painted in, but I like having the different tone to it, to the kind of brownish sepia bench that we have. You can darken it. Do add your color in layers. You will never be disappointed if you just add a little bit at the time, and stop when you have enough. It's harder to take it off than it is to put it back on. So here are the 2 illustrations that I've done, and you can see even using the exact same products, they look a little bit different. And I realized with them side by side that I had forgotten to do the shadow. So I'm adding a little African violet and sepia to my palette. That bench is going to create a cast shadow. So I'm going to mix those 2 together with a little bit of water, and I'm just going to brush it across. Again, I'm not doing a lot there. I just want there to be the sense that the sun is making a cast shadow of the bench. Makes everything look dimensional. And of course, because it was there, I had to stop and do a few more little details, but it just doesn't take much to make this little illustration look so much like a watercolor painting. It is a watercolor painting, and you did it. You can do this. I love this, being able to create these little illustrations. They're great to put in, make a card out of, or frame it for goodness sakes and give it as a little gift. Always sign and date. Normally I would say that right at the end, but you notice that I thought I was done and signed it way long ago, and then realized I had a bunch left to do. So here you see the finished product. Here it is in my bullet journal, and I've also made a card. If you would like to join us for the reading through the New Testament, I'd love for you to find us on Facebook. It is the Illuminated Journaling New Testament Journey. It's not too late to join us, and we're having a great time reading through the New Testament during this year. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope you'll subscribe and make sure that you catch all of our videos. I'll see you soon.